Hello and welcome to Note Doctors Summer Shorts. My name is Paul.
My name is Jenn.
My name is Ben.
And we are your hosts. We are all university music theory instructors who are passionate about music theory and music theory instruction. In these short episodes, we will be sharing with each other and all of you musical examples and teaching tips covering a wide range of topics. So if you want to know more about music theory and the most effective and innovative ways to teach it, this is the podcast for you. Hello and welcome back to Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Well, we have made it to our last episode of our summer book club, where we have been reading Philip Ewell's On Music Theory and Making Music More Welcoming for Everyone. Listeners, if you've been listening and reading along, hopefully you've been getting something out of this book. We certainly have. There's so much richness in this text. And in this chapter, or in this episode, we're going to be talking about the final chapter, which is chapter 6, and then the outro. And then kind of closing with our kind of final thoughts on the book. And so before, though, we get into talking about chapter 6, which is discussing music theory's kind of anti-Semitism, I wanted to come back to just one thing that we didn't get a chance to talk about from the last episode, which was on chapters 4 and 5, where Ewell talks about how we should approach kind of analyzing popular music, especially as white music theorists, or just kind of as we are living in this white racial frame of music theory, how we should go about taking a popular music example and using it in our class. And what are your thoughts on that, guys?
Well, I'm sure a lot of you have heard at recent SMTs, AMS conferences, etc., that they will often read, whether it's a presenter or a presiding chair of a session, will often read a land acknowledgement agreement that acknowledges this land was taken from whoever indigenous peoples, and it's kind of a nice way of starting out the session by acknowledging those facts. And then what is a nice recommendation, I think, for those of us to think about that are teaching popular music in some way, shape, or form is consider a kind of land acknowledgement, quote unquote, or musical source acknowledgement or historical acknowledgement of how popular music has roots in blackness, and that I really need to word this better. This Phil is so good at wording these things so well. I am not, but I'm trying to extemporize. But acknowledging the history and the appropriation and things like that.
Exactly.
I know I've taught like The Lion Sleeps Tonight in class, and that that's an example where the person who wrote that song is like in poverty in the southern part of Africa, and here's people over here in America making millions of dollars off of it and completely stealing this lion song, and just acknowledging that is really important. I don't know. That's my take.
Absolutely. First of all, like making those voices that have been silenced in the history of that music unsilenced, unmuted, so to speak, because so much of it was appropriated, or the person who actually wrote it or recorded it first was eliminated from the history. This happens in jazz history too. And I think one of the things that I really took away from this book over and over was that in music theory, we've been eager to say that the context is not what we're talking about. We're just talking about the music, right? Mm-hmm. And that is the white racial frame at play. Trying to remove the context in which the music was written is not a proper way to analyze something. And so just being aware of context and acknowledging it and speaking about it as a part of analytical treatment of something, I think is really important.
Yeah, we humans can't escape our own context.
No.
Yeah, we think we can look at a piece of music without context, right?
Yeah,
that's
ridiculous.
a great point. One of the lessons that I like doing is when we get in popular music is looking at Hound Dog. It's made famous by Elvis Presley, but it was originally recorded by Big Mama Thornton, who was a black kind of blues, early rock and roll kind of singer. Interestingly enough, that song was written by her, written for her by Lieber and Stoller, who were a white two white guys who were a songwriting duo back then. So you have this interesting, these two white guys taking a kind of black blues form and then writing it for a black artist. And then the original lyric is, it's not about a dog at all. It's about this basically a guy who's a jerk, and and she's like, I don't want you around here anymore. I don't want you wagging your tail around here anymore, right? And so there's this like innuendos going on there, and then though it's appropriated by white artists, Elvis being the most famous but not the first, and they changed the lyrics to make it into this a dog basically, which makes no sense. Like, I thought you were high class. Like, that makes no sense to be talking about a dog, right? You never talk about a dog being high class, and yet that's how it changes. And even if you Google hound dog, it comes up as song by Elvis Presley. Like, that's the first thing, right? And so, I mean, that's just a good example of this erasure of blackness from this song. And so that's one thing that I've done. I need to do more of that, but I thought that's helpful because then you can play, you can see on YouTube, there's performance videos of Big Mama Thornton singing it. It's a very different style than the Elvis Presley, and then kind of talking about those things. But I think you're right, Jen, the context, we can't ignore anymore. We have to acknowledge it.
I mean, I think in some ways that's his point. We were never ignoring it. We were just like putting this like white male racial frame on it and claiming that rules everything,
Yeah.
Yeah. We just weren't acknowledging it. It was always there. We just weren't saying so. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we're going to be using popular music, we need to, not just acknowledge, but also goes a step further with engaging with, scholars, BIPOC scholars who are doing this work, because he also challenges us to not just acknowledge, but also move past those theoretical frameworks that are basically have been created by whiteness, which I think is the hardest part. For me, it's like, well, how do I talk about this music without using Roman numerals or, all these tools that have come out of, our white racial frame? I think that's the more challenging thing for me and that I have to do more work in, is being able to learn, these different ways of explaining and analyzing music that are different than what I've experienced and what I've been trained in.
Totally. And kind of tagging on, kind of leading us into chapter 6, you have these composers that people think of anti-Semitism. A lot of times they might think of like Wagner.
He's the only one, right?
Or
Ben?
only Wagner.
He's the only one, right? He's the bad one. We all know that, Ben. We can move on.
Yeah, but man, once you read this chapter 6, I mean, definitely for me, it changed my perspective and kind of opened up some new lenses to view this and say, whoa, it's not just Wagner, basically, is a big point that's raised here, but Tchaikovsky and a lot of other composers that are mentioned in this chapter. I really encourage everyone to dig in and look at some of the people that you're probably teaching this year in your class. They're in this chapter, chances are.
And I think one of the arguments that's used often, and Ewell pushes back on this, is that, well, that's just how it was, right? That's
right.
just
the product of their time.
Right, the product of their time, right? Who can blame them for being anti-Semitic? Everybody was. But that's not a good answer, right?
Well, and if that were the answer, we could still say that now. Like, we still are in a white racial frame. So are we all supposed to just be products of that, or are we supposed to acknowledge it and try to move on from it? There were always people who believed differently, about both race, about Judaism, about gender. There have always been people who believed differently. So to blame history rather than people is not really right.
I'm curious as to, I didn't plan this, but did either of you, while reading this chapter, think like of yourself being in like a future iteration of this book, or like, what are people going to look back and say about music theorists on the Note Doctors, or like, how we had acknowledged in our time, I think about that a lot when I was reading this, of how how our generation of theorists, or certain people in our generation of theorists, are going to be perceived, and like how we're kind of painting our 2023 picture of music theory, or what is music theory in 23, and how we shape that. It's like a really hard question to wrestle with. It's really gotten me thinking a lot, but it's an important one to think about how we have our mindset, especially just going into this school year now that we're in August. You really want to think about your mindset and how are you framing your course materials. How are you teaching that Tchaikovsky example? What are you going to say? What is your front loading that you're going to do, or what is your kind of context that you're going to present for that particular example? How much are you going to use Roman numerals this year versus what you did last year? That's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and I don't know if I have like 100% correct answer to it per se, but I think just thinking about it is at least one step.
Yeah, it's at least a start. For sure. No, I've had similar thoughts of like, we can't know what future people are going to look at and think that we got right or wrong necessarily. But it's the whole when you know better, you do better kind of thing. Like, no one's perfect. Everyone's going to make mistakes, and actually acknowledging that all of us have like ingrained systemic racism, misogyny, all of those things is an important part of this process. Seeing it in yourself. Like when he says the only two people I've ever called racist are Schenker and Phil Ewell, it's seeing it in yourself and seeing the ways that like it impacts you and things you've thought. That's a critical step.
Yeah, there needs to be this level of responsibility about being better, but also having this I guess humility as well, where we're gonna do the best we can, hopefully, but we're not gonna reach the pinnacle. We're not gonna be perfect, and I think that can help. At least it helps me to think about others that may not be where I'm at. Thinking like, well, if only they would think like me, because then I'm the enlightened one or something like that, but, thinking, 50, 100 years from now, the things that I think I'm doing right may be entirely wrong, or people are going to see things that I never saw in my teaching, or not that they're going to be talking about me in 100 years, but you know what I mean. And so I think that gives you this kind of sense of humility as well, where like, okay, I don't have it all together, and I need to do better than I am now, but I'm not gonna, and that helps me not to judge others as much.
I think like so often we want everything to be like clean or nice or easy. And as I was reading the book over and over again, I was like, the reality is that like being a human is just a messy, messy thing. Like one of the ones in this chapter that hit me really hard was Bach, right? Yeah. Like he talks about anti-Semitism in St. John's Passion, I think it is. And I was like, not Bach. Like, not
Soli
him
Deo
too.
Gloria. Come on.
Like, well, and like just we have composers, we have, public figures, we have friends and loved ones up on pedestals that we have made, and everyone is messy. And no one is above being impacted by, like, these ideas.
Yeah.
And including us.
Yep.
So.
So true.
Yeah.
So true.
Yeah, Jen, you and I, especially going to a Christian undergrad.
Yes.
I mean, Bach was the composer. I mean,
the model. Yeah.
The model, right? Soli Deo Gloria after every one of his compositions, right?
No one is clean, right? Like everyone is a little bit messy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Totally. So on to a path forward, and there you go. It is in the outro. If you're looking for a path forward, the outro is the place to start. What are y'all's thoughts on the outro?
Phil has found a way in this book to remain so hopeful and so like kind and gentle to his majority white colleagues who are the audience for this text. And I just appreciated that you know, like you leave this book with a feeling of like, here's some stuff I can do. And not a feeling of like, what do I do now? Which is sometimes how you feel when you read. You know, I've done a lot of reading around anti-racism, and occasionally I've set those books down and been like, it's all too heavy. I don't know what to do now. Like, I agree and I see it and I don't know what to do. But Phil, there's so many like clear steps to be taken, and that's a real kindness that he did, I think, in this last chapter in the outro.
Yeah, this one quote he has, I think, near the beginning of that chapter really resonated with me. He says, "The solution is not finding the one BIPOC theorist who conforms to the white male frame of the field, but rather the solution lies in changing the framing of the field itself." And I feel like that's what his book is doing.
Yeah.
It's making us realize that there is this frame, and just inserting, you know, these token pieces by Black composers or these genres is not doing anything to really disrupt the problem that lies at the heart of this. And so it's really just changing the framing of the field itself, which kind of leads him to these recommendations that he makes. I think he has 24 of them that help totally reframe the field of music theory. And so any of those recommendations resonate with you all?
A lot of them, yeah. You know, the piano thing hit me too. I've talked a lot about how I use these like mini pianos in my class. And as I was thinking about it, reading this, I thought, you know, there's other ways for students to demonstrate the skills I'm looking for without using a piano. There might be some times where they could sing those skills. I use the pianos because so many of my students are singers, and they don't have that like external to their body way of representing notes or a scale or a chord. And they often find it really helpful. But maybe some of them are guitar players. They could spell chords while playing them on the guitar. There's no reason why they have to just play like Roman numeral 1, C, E, G. You know, they could do that on a guitar. It doesn't have to be on a keyboard. So I actually have changed. I have keyboard quizzes in my written theory classes, and I have actually changed them to be performance quizzes and looked for ways that students can demonstrate the same skills using a performance medium that is most comfortable for them, like giving them an element of choice in that process. And I anticipate that a lot of them will probably pick the piano anyway or a keyboard anyway, but you know, why not make it easier or less daunting or, you know, more in their already existing set of tools?
Yeah, I love that. And I think recently, I think it was Justin London had a chapter about that, how we're so focused on just singing and piano as like these just two ways of demonstrating, you know, and even, you know, in our proficiency requirement, you know, it's not like everyone has a saxophone proficiency requirement, you know. I mean, if you put that out there, it sounds ridiculous, but then yet we are like having this piano proficiency requirement, or, you know, even when you look at NASM, you know, same type of deal. And I've thought about that a lot. I've thought about, could I have everyone in my class bring the instrument to class? For my section, that would be a little insane because it would be 150.
It's a big band.
And how many of those are not in C? I thought, oh man, I'm going to run into a problem. But I have done little ensembles, like, you know, I would have the euphoniums do a thing, or I'd have a group of saxophones do a thing, and I would kind of go around the different studios and things like that. I thought maybe I should be doing more of that too. And I didn't have the keyboard quizzes in my curriculum like Jenn did, but you know, just brainstorming ideas of how to get out of that piano and singing, piano or singing all the time, you know.
Right.
The singing is not that comfortable for some people too. I mean, singing can be a roadblock.
Right. I mean, my students are mostly singers, so there's that. But yeah, that's why they lean heavily that way because we don't have an instrumental program. Go ahead.
You know, one of my summer projects was revamping my dictation homeworks for one of my oral skills classes, and so I spent the summer writing all these dictations and doing things, and I recorded a number of my colleagues playing dictation melodies for dictation, and because up to this point it's always been piano or like keyboard sounds. Every one of their homework is keyboard sounds, and so this semester in All Skills 4 we're going to have flute and trombone dictations and violin and clarinet and bass clarinet. We even have an accordion. We have some piano still, and I mean, because you can't do a harmonic dictation very easily. But I did think about maybe I could try doing like a string quartet maybe next summer. But I'm super eager to try these out on these students, especially since they've been through 3 semesters or even 4 semesters if they're an intro class of dictations with just piano sounds. And now they're going to be having dictations with all these other instruments. Are they going to find it more difficult? Are they going to find it easier? What are the band students going to think, right? Because we have a bunch of band students, and are they going to be like, oh yeah, I love hearing the flute and the trombone and all these things because that's what I hear every day in Wind Symphony or something like that, rather than this piano sound. So I'm super intrigued about that, and also the fact that when we get away from the piano, we get into other musical aspects that are important, like timbre, articulation. Articulation is really not something. I mean, you obviously can have staccato, things, but like the articulation palette is quite small on a piano compared to a violin or a trombone. So I have some different recordings of some of the players doing different articulations, like tonguing everything versus slurring. So maybe I'll try playing those and seeing if people can hear those things. And so
That's cool.
I'm super excited,
Very cool.
but it's something that I'm a pianist too. Like, so the piano is so easy for me to fall back into. And, it's hard for me to imagine, a good theory teacher that doesn't play the piano well, but that's just my own bias. Like, that's just me, because like I can just go in and play and it works so easily for me. But that's just a personal bias, and that's just what I'm comfortable with.
Right.
So, yeah.
And I'm not a great pianist. I can play. I have like decently functional skills, but it was never my primary instrument. And it was hard for me to imagine that too. Like, I mean, some of it, again, it's a natural, but I started piano lessons at like 4. So I have played as long as I remember. I learned to read music around the same time I learned to read words. So I don't have a memory of that not being something I did.
Well, it's funny. I probably play the least of the 3 of us. I probably play the least piano. But when I'm teaching a class, I rarely will play trumpet, which is my instrument.
Right,
and it's like, that's
horn.
evidence right there. It's like, piano's definitely not my instrument. Like, I play okay enough to get by in things, But I just kind of assumed, well, I'm not going to have my trumpet for theory teaching. I'm going to have a piano, clearly. You know what I mean? It's just like, there we are in practice doing exactly what,
Yeah.
kind of subconsciously fitting into that.
Well, and as you were saying that, Paul, I was thinking like maybe you two have had this experience as well. I feel like it's a universal experience where you do dictation in class as a college, freshman or sophomore, and then you go and you listen to something. Maybe even for another class, you're listening to like a Brahms symphony and you're like, I'm having a really hard time like figuring out this melody or because the timbres are so different, and I've only been trained to do this one thing. Like it takes real focus and effort to make that transfer the first time or two that you have to do it. So yeah, we're doing a disservice because we're really narrowing the field of music that our students can interact with if they don't have access to all these other timbres.
The light bulb moment for me was when I had a student who plays the bassoon come in and play a melodic dictation. The students' brains exploded because they're like, this sounds high and low at the same time. Like, where do we even write the first note down? Because it was such a rich and unique timbre. They've heard bassoon before, but being able to think about what note is that, where is that, it was so different for them. So I was like, this is a problem. I need to do something about this.
Yeah.
Well, I will say, changing the subject, but maybe importantly, one of the most probably overtly German-centric parts of the recommendations is the graduate foreign language requirement.
Yeah.
I think we've all encountered this in our studies, many of us. And my goodness, a lot of times it's not just a, European language that's required. A lot of foreign language requirements will spell out German is required. And then some people have to take semesters upon semesters of German. I got lucky. I took 2 semesters of accelerated German. And it was just the writing and translation part. So do I speak German very well? No. 9. But,
I took 5 semesters, and I don't really either.
I took all this Spanish
Yeah.
in high school, and I feel like I do speak Spanish okay, and I can understand Spanish when I watch TV, and that does you no good. And even that is a European language, and you think, wait a minute, where did we go wrong here? This is one of the things that stuck out to me as very, very particularly German-centric, and maybe seconded by French, maybe is what's mentioned in recommendation number 7 is what I'm looking at. Yeah.
Those are the 2 I took. What 2 did you take, Ben?
I took Italian as my second, but I didn't take any courses on it. I just did the audio tapes, 30 minutes a day, kind of Duolingo style or Pimsleur style. And I did okay with it, I did okay. I did bene, not molto bene, but bene.
You are so bilingual, man. You're code switching like crazy.
I won't switch to Czech. I don't want to leave people out. I'm learning Czech now. But yeah, it's just like even if you take European languages, it seems that not even those are treated as, okay, you can study any of these languages. Or if you grew up speaking Thai, one of my TAs grew up speaking Thai, and it's like, wow, what an asset, to have like a person who can read Thai and like study Thai music, and wow, that's so cool. But then when you look at the requirements on paper, a lot of times it's like, now this person has to go and take German? What? To me, it seems like an artificial barrier and kind of a policy that really could use some revisiting and revising both.
Well, it takes me back to when we talked to Lee, and what she found in her work, of course, was that the people who said, yes, the language requirement was useful were the people who used it in their research. So really, perhaps it should be some later part of your coursework after you have a sense of what you might want to research. If you're going to research something where you don't have to read in a foreign language at all, maybe you'd be better off learning recording or computer languages or, something completely else, that is much more relevant to what you want to study and what you want to write about.
Yeah, the fact that you have to learn your languages before your research project is just another way that right racial frame stays intact. Because if you're only having to study those languages, what are you going to do your main research on? Well, I only know how to read German and French. Well, I guess I'll do German and French music, right? That's and no one is intentionally doing that, right? But that's a byproduct of this white racial frame is that, if your language requirement comes before your research interest, you're going to then go into those languages. But if you flipped it around and maybe had your research interest first, then okay, what language or no language at all do you need to study? Then that opens up a whole host of areas of research.
Right. If you're doing a PED dissertation, maybe you're taking a bunch of educational psychology classes or educational research classes or, things like that are much more relevant. So I think just providing a lot more choice across the board, there's probably still going to be people who need to learn German to research what they want to research. But there's also, how many times while we've been reading this book have we said, I need to learn so much more about all of this other, that research still needs to be done. And, we're not making space for it with requirements like this.
No, I think people think, oh, it's just a language requirement or, it's just PhD students. But the impact of it is a lot deeper because you think those PhD students potentially are going to be like, the professors, and like with research areas, just like y'all are saying. I mean, the impact of that is actually pretty far reaching, I would say. Just every little policy, if you go through every single one, you think, well, how many of these policies have these far reaching impacts? A lot of them do. That seems small, but it has a lot of deep impact on the field and the way the field is shaped for the next 10 to 20 years especially.
Right. And it's not inevitable. I think that's one of the things that's I think about with this book is that he reveals that the way where we are at is not this inevitable like place that it has to be. Like every one of these decisions were made by humans, right? And so they're contingent, meaning that we can change where we want to go. It's not like this is how it has to be. Perhaps the reason why there's so much Schenkerian analysis and study is because all the theorists had to study German. Well, then what are they going to study? Well, German theorists. Who's the best one? Schenker, right? And so is Schenker required because it's the best, or just because that's what everyone is trained in German? I don't know. Right. But that's one of his other recommendations.
Probably real mad at you right now, Paul. Just saying.
He's a composer.
Here we go.
He was the theorist too.
I know. Actually, I love Schoenberg. I'll take Schoenberg any day.
Era.
Yeah. But so that's one of his other recommendations is not to just get rid of Schenkerian analysis, but to make it optional, right? If someone wants to study that, absolutely, but not making it this requirement.
Yeah, making sure you're doing a really good front loading of, if you're teaching linear analysis or whatnot, to acknowledge that and make sure that you give the proper context and make sure that you do that in the right way. Yeah, that's a really good recommendation too.
This is sort of a related thing, but he talks about proficiency exams and entrance exams and things like that are often a part of our kind of music culture. We have one where I work. I oversee one where I work for putting students into Theory 1 versus Fundamentals. And I know, Ben, at UNT, they've done away with Fundamentals. All the students start out together in Theory 1. There's some decent research out there, and I think I might dig into it a bit at some point this fall if I can find time. That's always the critical part. In the middle of writing our NASM self-study, so there's that. But if I can find the time, there's a lot of research on math and remediation, and it doesn't work. Students do much better in math if they all just start out together in the same room at the same time, learning the same things. And if some students are behind and don't have the skills they need, they're much more likely to form them alongside these other students. And part of me is like, that's probably also true for music theory. It does create the issue of like the trailing sections. If you don't have a huge program, what are you going to do about the students who fail? Do they now have to wait a whole year, basically until they can take the class again? So it creates these other kind of practical problems, but it's worth asking the question of like, what atmosphere are we creating, or who are we holding back, or what is the experience of being a student who is told that you need remediation? And of course, I never say it that way. I say, like, we want to put you in the class that's the best fit so that you're the most successful. I also don't, it's not mandatory. So when I'm working with a student, I say, this is my recommendation. But if you say, like, I don't care about an easy A, I'm going to work really hard, I will, do what I need to do in Theory 1, then you can take Theory 1. And if I have said that Theory 1 is the recommendation, but you're like, oh, I'm not sure, I feel scared, you can take Fundamentals. And all of those things do happen. So I do feel at least good about that they are not forced to take a class that doesn't count toward their degree. And students will kind of voluntarily switch during that first week as well. And we help them with that process too. But is it serving them? I hope so, but I don't know for sure. And this definitely raised more questions along that line for me.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat as you, Jen. And so we have a Fundamentals and a Theory 1, but And I do this. I say the same things as you do, where this is the best fit for you, where we want you to succeed. And of course, if you're really adamant that theory one, I'm not going to stop you. I'll give my professional opinion on that. But if the research shows that it's not, it's actually hurting, that then some hard decisions are going to have to be made. But the struggle for me is, as you mentioned, the lack of a trailing class. So if a student does fail theory one, I don't have enough students to have a theory one then in the spring. Perhaps in the future I will, I don't know. So they have to wait a whole year. And that was one of the big benefits of changing, that we changed. We added the fundamentals a number of years ago, is that students were like, oh, thank goodness I failed. Now I don't have to wait a whole year. So I don't know what the solution is for that, but or just convincing upper administration to let a class of 5 make. I don't know.
Oh man,
sounds
That'll
impossible.
Be the day. That'll be the
I'm
day.
living that right now. I'm living it right now, trying to get ready for fall, and I'm having to make tough decisions, and it stinks.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. I mean, anecdotally, the students who go into fundamentals and are in they're called all sorts of things. The trailing section, the off semester. It's a terrible way to put it.
It is.
But that those students anecdotally are often not as strong. And it might be easy to say well, duh, they started out behind, or they, so of course they're not going to be as strong. But I'm not so convinced anymore that that's really what's going on, that maybe they weren't having the same level of rich conversations in those classes, or maybe, they weren't getting to go as deep because too much time was spent on drill, or, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but
Yeah, I will
this
say
definitely made me think.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I will say that, since I've been here teaching the core theory classes, some of my colleagues have advocated to switch back to, and these may or may not be theory colleagues, I'm just talking about in general, just in our college music. And, one of my arguments back has always been that some of the best students I've had would have been in the fundamentals and would have been on that separate track, or maybe fundamentals track, we could call it. And those students may have not had the strongest reading abilities, or the things that, those proficiency tests have, highlighted, meaning can you write a scale in the bass clef or something? They may have just done treble, but man, are they good at treble, or are they good at treble? You know what I mean? But they may have made a 50 on the exam because they got all the treble stuff right and all the bass clef stuff wrong. And it's take a couple weeks and read some stuff in the bass clef, and boom, they're the best student in your class, and I've always had, and maybe it's just because it's a very large sample size from my classes, I've always had students that have come in and taken a little bit longer at the beginning to get quicker at certain activities, whether that's just, it could be just solfege, it could be reading bass clef, it could be just writing, the act of taking what's in your head and just writing it on a staff. Any of those activities, they were slower at the beginning, but then, oh my goodness, by the end of the semester, they're some of my best students. Their composition projects are just unreal. And, I'm just, man, I'm so glad that you are not having to then start Theory 1 in the spring, in January. So, but it's hard because then you do have, the flip side is there. You have those people that, it's hard to spend the time to get them caught up in a certain way. So that is true too. And luckily we do have always, the ability to take Theory 1 in the spring as well without the enrollment issues. So it's tricky. That's such a tricky issue.
Well, and, again, anecdotally, we all know that when it really comes down to it, what best predicts how the student is going to do is sort of how much resilience they have, how much
grit,
how much grit they have, how hard are they willing to work, and then more so, how stable is their life outside of your class, right? Mm-hmm. All of these things are factors that are more telling, probably, than how well they read treble or bass clef on that first day.
Right. Do you know Ace G or whatever on the bass clef? Or,
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're saying our students have a context, just like the pieces of
Yes.
music that we're analyzing.
Totally.
Yes, they do.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good takeaway. I like that, Paul.
Any other of those recommendations? I mean, we're not going to go through all of them. I think if you're reading along, read each one of them and think about them, because I think there's so many, and this is technically a summer short, so we're trying to keep it short.
Yeah.
But any kind of closing thoughts? Kind of.
Well, one last one that stuck out to me is when Phil mentions the kind of trend that we've seen lately of boycotting conference locations.
Oh yeah.
In places with political issues where either there's homophobia or, obvious white supremacy, or, with the recent Roe v. Wade situation, laws that are, harming women, things like that. And he points out how damaging that is. Mm-hmm. You're robbing those economies of things that they need. And often the people who you're most trying to help are the people who you're harming by, not going to those places. And I just remember that when SMT was in San Antonio, like, those organizers had to work really hard to get the conference to be in San Antonio, which as a city itself would embrace all of the things that they were upset about. I believe it was LGBTQ things at the time that were making them concerned about coming to Texas. But San Antonio in general is it's a big city, so
Right.
there's a lot of opinions, a lot of ideas, and it's not necessarily an unsafe place in that way. And I know that's a conversation that has happened a lot, and it makes me think about how all of our conferences, many of them are in the winter, and they are often in like Minneapolis and Denver. It's freezing cold there, guys. Come to the South. It's nice here. It's nice here in November.
That's hilarious.
That's my final thought. Texas is,
So DBU
not
is going to be
snowy
hosting
in
the
November.
SMT. We're picking up what you're putting down.
No.
Yeah. Well, I think that is an interesting thing, because it's like speaking to the privilege that some folks have, I guess, within academia or whatever, is like, well, yeah, just come to New York, come to California each time. I mean, does anyone in those, like, did anyone in the state of Texas be like, no, you shouldn't come here?
No. I remember being thrilled that I could, for once in my life, drive to SMT.
Yeah.
Like, I have never, any other occasion other than New Orleans, been able to drive. And New Orleans is actually a fairly long drive. It's like a 9-hour drive, but it's at least doable. Every other time I've had to fly. So, yeah, I mean, no, those of us who live here were like, yay! Just like everyone else. I'm sure the people who live in Minnesota are thrilled when they get to just, go home to their own bed at night. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up our first ever summer book club, what are your takeaways? It's been nice to read an academic book. I know, Jen, you've probably read about 15 books this summer already.
Not all academic, though.
Oh, not all academic. But I think I finished this book and immediately started thinking of ways that I can change up my theory classroom. And I think it's, as you mentioned, Jen, he is hopeful, and you get a sense that he's writing this book out of this sense of hope and sense of love for music theory and just the music theory community. I agree. He doesn't, he's not coming down on people. He's so kind, especially in the section where he's going through the ways that he has been kind of ridiculed and verbally or abused on email and things like that. Like he doesn't come back, at those people. And I think that's really commendable. And I think I think it's a powerful book. I think it's one of those books where we're going to be reading about it. We're going to be reading it in, history of music theory class.
Absolutely. I was going to say the same thing.
Something like that. This book is going to be in there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to say thank you to Phil Ewell for writing this amazing publication. And I can't even imagine undertaking something like this. And you did it so well. So congratulations on a job well done. And I hope everyone is able to read it. Everyone who's even tangentially involved can dig their hands in and get some good ideas, fresh perspectives.
Absolutely. Thank you, Phil.
You just made it to the end of another episode of Note Doctors, the music theory and pedagogy podcast. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and review the podcast, and you can always reach us at notedoctorspodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or show ideas. Thanks for listening.